Hello, welcome to our webinar. I'm Kevin Gray. I am the President and Chief Content Officer of Westchester Education Services, and today we'll be exploring some emerging trends in the K-12 education, specifically social emotional learning, culturally relevant education, and CTE. And so with me, I have Melissa Schlinger, who is the VP of Practice and Programs at CASEL, Dr. Gloria Pelaez, who is an educational consultant with a long history of working in CRE, bilingual education, diversity education, and all sorts of other areas. And then I have Rich Portelance, who's the CEO and founder of CareerPath Mobiles, a career and technical education app that helps students with determining where they're headed. So I'd like to dive right in here. Melissa, let's start with you, and let's start with what is SEL? I think you're still on mute.
Yep. Thank you so much for having me. And I appreciate the invitation to share information with you all. I did want to just share a few slides to kind of help ground us in the what is SEL conversation. So let me just quickly pull those up and we'll look at those together. So when we talk about what is SEL, let me get right into it. SEL, which you may know, we've recently updated our definition. This is our new updated definition. It's the process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply knowledge, skills, and attitudes so that they can develop healthy identities, manage their emotions, achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy, establish good relationships, and make good decisions. I mean, in a nutshell, it's basically how do we understand ourselves? How do we understand and engage positively with others? And how do we make good decisions that benefit the individual and the group? That's basically what SEL is. We know that right now there's a lot of confusion about what SEL is. When CASEL defines SEL, this is our definition on our website. This is our framework that many folks are familiar with. One of the updates that we've made actually is to look at these rings more closely because the context matters so much. Our model is not simply about what are the competencies that we're promoting, but the environments in which they are promoted. That includes the classroom environment, the school environment, at home with families and caregivers, and in our communities. And how are those opportunities and environments sort of have a coordinated approach? Really quickly, when we think about self-awareness, these orange sections on the self, here's where we're talking about really understanding our emotions, our identities, our strengths, our growth mindset, our self-efficacy, how we understand our biases, and our sense of purpose. And the self-management piece is kind of what we do with all of that understanding. How do we manage those emotions? How do we manage our impulses? How do we manage stress? Can we stay motivated and persevere even in obstacles? Can we set goals? Can we stay organized? Can we take initiative and demonstrate agency? And then those are the areas of self. When we think about how we interact with others and how we understand others, social awareness is really the understanding of others. So can I take their perspective? Can I share, show empathy and compassion, gratitude? Do I appreciate diversity? Can I pay attention to the social norms and demands of different environments? And do I contribute to and experience that sense of belonging that we feel with each other? And relationship skills is really what we do. So how do we communicate? How do we engage positively in relationships? How do we demonstrate cultural competence and build teamwork? How do we stand up for the rights of others? How do we demonstrate leadership? These are all sort of our relationship skills. And then how do we put this all together so that we can continue to be curious, we can continue to be open, we can work on identifying problems and solutions and understanding who those solutions, the solutions, how they have impact on ourselves and others, how do we behave ethically? That's all the responsible decision making. So what we know is that these competencies are super important, whether your goal is academic achievement, this is really a foundational to that. Or if your goal is workforce readiness, employers are saying, these are the things we need future employees to have. Or if your goal is achieving equity, we know that social emotional learning is foundational for the equity mission. So social emotional learning is something that is agreed upon on both sides of the aisle as critically important for a number of important outcomes. And not just policymakers, but educators, parents, and the students themselves are really saying this is super important for us, and we know that this is helpful. There's plenty of research on our website that can show you the benefits of promoting social and emotional competence in all these different areas. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the research, but I would invite you to visit casel.org if you're interested in getting into the research. And also recognizing that how these things are coordinated across environments is critically important, that it's not simply a lesson every Friday or a climate strategy, but that these are things that are coordinated across. CASEL really thinks about 10 areas of school-wide SEL. We're really encouraging schools to take what we call a systemic approach to SEL as opposed to a programmatic or a more narrow approach. And when we think about the systems that are surrounding us, here we're talking about not just explicit SEL instruction, which is of course critically important, but also how do you promote SEL while you're teaching academics? How do you engage the youth so that they have a voice and can use their own leadership and develop their own leadership skills? How do you create that positive climate in the classroom and in the school? How do you provide opportunities for the adults themselves to develop their own SEL and to have opportunities to build relationships with each other and with students? And how do you have a discipline policy that is not punitive or exclusionary, but actually provides opportunity for reflection and growth and is more restorative? How do you meet the needs of kids who have different abilities? So an MTSS approach to SEL is also important. And then how do you engage authentically with parents, not just sending out newsletters, but really relationships with parents, inviting them into the process. And how do we align with our community partners so it doesn't feel like we're all using a different language and different approaches, but we share a common goal. And then lastly, what are you measuring and how are you monitoring to see if you are constantly improving your implementation and outcomes for kids? This is really how CASEL defines a systemic approach to SEL that benefits kids and that we know is something that folks agree on is critically important. One last point I'll make before I turn it back over is there are a number of challenges in the field, and we know that providers are key elements to helping us address these challenges. The biggest challenge is really just people understanding what SEL is and what it is not. There's a lot of people that are not quite understanding exactly what SEL is. They may think of it as we need these kids to behave, and they take a deficit approach. We want to, those kids are broken. Let's put SEL in to fix broken kids, which we know that SEL is actually building on strengths. Or they may be confusing SEL with particular goals that people have for their SEL work. But sort of getting clarity on what it is and what it is not. Also understanding like who in the school and district is the owner. People used to think this was like the social worker's job or the counselor's job, but it's actually everyone's role. The bus driver, the security folks, the principal, the teachers, everyone has a role in that SEL work. We also think people think, I don't want to do SEL because it takes time away from academics, which we know is not true. Actually, it's not in competition, it's supporting. One of the biggest challenges is that people don't know where to start. They know it's important, but they don't really know where to begin. And so we have a lot of resources to help people understand, how do I do an assessment, a rubric assessment, and figure out where I should start. One big challenge is that currently teacher prep programs don't include SEL. So it's up to the districts and schools to provide that professional learning, which puts a burden on them financially and in terms of time. We know, and this is a place where hopefully you all can help, that schools have a difficult time understanding what high quality evidence-based SEL looks like that's comprehensive and not simply just a lesson here and there, that would really support their systemic approach. Another challenge is just the idea that this is one more thing rather than really coordinating those things around a common goal. And then lastly, trying to align SEL to those existing priorities and frameworks is a key challenge. So people need to understand kind of how SEL fits in with their PBIS or their restorative approach or their MTSS frameworks, of that alignment. These are some of the key challenges that CASEL is seeing in the field. With that, I'm going to stop sharing and take it back over to you, Kevin.
Yeah, so thank you. That was a super helpful overview, and we'll share this video so folks will have those slides. SEL is not new, right? It's been around for decades, but we're certainly hearing more of it in the last few years. And it seems like the last 5 to 6 years has really been a stronger emphasis, and in particular in the last year or two. Why now?
Well, it's a good point. And I think in 2011, a meta-analysis was released that demonstrated sort of unequivocally the important role that SEL has on outcomes, both short-term outcomes like academic gains, where kids improved 11 percentile points, and also showed less emotional distress and better life outcomes, and also long-term outcomes and longitudinal studies. So in 2011, it really people started to pay close attention to the importance of this. In more recent times, we're seeing even more interest in SEL as schools and districts are prioritizing their work to be more equitable. They recognize that SEL has a role in their equity mission. And also in thinking about the pandemic, how do we stay connected? How do we heal from trauma? How do we relate to each other? And how do we really manage ourselves and stress when we are facing such uncertainty? So certainly the last year with the racial reckoning in the country and also the global pandemic has brought SEL to the forefront, and people have really realized just how critical these competencies are.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought up the pandemic and the racial reckoning. What sort of advice are you giving folks when they're saying, okay, I mean, we were at the Ed Week Summit a few weeks ago, and they did some analysis of what districts and teachers are looking for, and SEL was at the top of the list for most of these places. But as you've noted, there's a lot of sort of confusion around what that means, or okay, we're just going to buy this SEL off-the-shelf product and put it in the classroom, and then everyone will get along and it'll be fine. That's obviously not very realistic. So what kind of advice are you giving schools and districts or providers who are creating these programs to sort of manage those expectations so they get the outcome that you're really looking for?
Yeah, and we've seen schools and districts implementing SEL for all different kinds of goals that they have based on their local context. If there's, a school in Wisconsin that's really focused on workforce readiness and high school, they may recognize that SEL is critical for that and have a different implementation focus than another school that is like really focused on their equity mission and recognizes that SEL plays a role in that, or at a third school that's really focused on academics and recognizes the SEL role there. So there's lots of different ways that schools and districts think about their SEL work and how it achieves their goals. So CASEL has put forth resources to help educators importantly figure out what your goals are and how you'll measure them. It might be a climate survey, or it might be graduation rates, or it might be academic achievement. So figuring out what's the needle you're trying to move, and then planning an implementation that allows you to work towards that goal through a process. And all the resources on CASEL's website are free. Notably, we have a school-wide guide to SEL. I'll drop the link in the chat, that helps schools think through, like, what should I be doing if my goal is X, or how do I think through that, and developing their plan. So indeed, there is a lot of confusion about that, but really, SEL has been around, as you pointed out, for decades. And we know that it can be beneficial for kids in all communities for different kinds of goals.
Excellent. And one last question that I think is sort of related to that. A lot of the content providers in the space now are looking at this and saying, wow, SEL is a heavy demand. we've got to figure out how to work that into our programs. What sort of advice would you give those folks who are looking at getting into the SEL space as a program, or also those looking at integrating it into their core content?
Yeah, I think the key for integrating into core content is not thinking about it as an add-on. When I was a teacher back in Fairfax County, Virginia, decades ago, we had these big paper teacher's guides, and in the margins, it would say like ELL connections or school to home connections. And it was kind of considered like an optional piece that if you wanted to focus on, you can. What we would encourage providers to do is actually construct the lesson in a way that promotes social and emotional learning at its core, that it's not sort of like, if I want to do SEL2, I do it this way, but rather actually develop lessons that promote social and emotional competency. So for example, opportunities for cooperative structures within a lesson, whether it's partner sharing or project-based learning, those kinds of social environments in small groups give kids opportunities to develop relationships, to listen to and react to different points of view, to problem solve together, to develop empathy, to get to know each other, all these really critical skills. So it's really about how do we construct the lesson. I will also drop into the chat some guidance for how SEL looks when integrated in with academic instruction. But it's really about thinking about how do you create opportunities with the lesson you're developing to build social emotional competence as part of it. How do you make sure that the youth have voice opportunities? And how do you support through your professional learning, not just expertise, but the adult's own SEL competence and relationship skills with their kids and each other?
Yeah, excellent. And I think this segues really nicely. Gloria, I've seen you nodding quite a bit here. And so let's transition to culturally responsive education. And let's talk about that for a bit. So I'll ask you the same question that I asked Melissa. Let's get us started with a definition. What is culturally responsive education or culturally responsive teaching?
Yes, thank you. First of all, Kevin, thanks a lot for the invite. It's a pleasure. And I did prepare some slides. Yeah, I'm a fan of CASEL. As a teacher educator, it was part of my planning, and my students really embraced it. And I think it's crucial. So thank you to Melissa for doing that. And Nicole, could we start? Perfect. And let's just go to the second slide. First of all, let me just say, like with SEL, there's a lot of misinformation about what culturally responsive teaching / education is. This term was coined by Gloria Billings in 1994. And basically, it's a pedagogy that recognizes what the students come to school with regarding their culture. And I'm not talking about race or ethnicity. I'm talking about what they're used to. Is there an oral tradition in their family? Do they learn better by doing, by listening, etc.? So it's basically respecting the pedagogy that recognizes the importance of including students' cultural references in all aspects of learning. And one thing that I want to make clear is that most of the literature in the last, especially 2 or 3 years, is referring to this as culturally responsive education, CRE. And it's important, Nicole. Next slide. Okay. It's basically using your cultural knowledge, what your prior experiences are, your frames of references. It obviously, Larson Billing formed this because she was working with students who were ethnically and economically diverse, most of them from marginalized communities. So she wanted to make the learning encounters more relevant to the students and for these learning encounters to be more effective, so that there was better communication between the teacher and the students, that there were no assumptions made by educators or principals or school administrators about the capacity of the kids and what they could bring to the table. And basically, culture impacts the way we communicate, how we think. It impacts how we approach a problem, how we approach learning, and also what is the content. Is this content worthy? And that is one of the big deals about culturally responsive education, because teachers and administrators and anybody in this field need to make sure that students understand that every content is important. Some of us don't like math, but we need it. And some of these things are mandatory and we have to embrace them. We also, one of the big keys about CRE is that it bridges experiences kids bring from school and experiences they bring from home, and then the academics and their realities. For example, when I was teaching, like Melissa said, well, she's very young, but many years ago, I was teaching in inner city school in Miami-Dade County Public Schools. And it was the first year that this Title I school also had a gifted program. A school that had been 98% free and reduced lunch, mostly African-American, Hispanic, now had a lot of gifted white children. And we invited the fire department to talk about fire safety. And I was just standing in the back of the cafeteria with the principal. And when we looked, the way the kids walked in was very marked because we could see almost a division. When the firemen started the presentation, one of the pictures show a big house with a pool, what to do if there's a fire, how you get out. And a lot of our kids who had been in the school, a long time, like were lost because that's not their cultural references. Most of these children live in apartment or government housing. They couldn't relate. And it goes back to some of the SEL principles that Melissa was sharing, that it has to be a community approach, a systemic approach. It cannot be like a salad that you can choose. And I remember the teacher editions that had this SEL, ESOL, for the gifted, for whatever. No, you have to construct your practice, your pedagogy, and your lesson plans with this in mind. They're all parts of the same whole. We have to have social emotional learning. We have to have cultural responsive education. We have to make the content meaningful to all students, okay? One of the cornerstones, if you will, of CRE is that when you're planning your lessons, have multiple representations of materials from different cultural groups, from different ethnic groups. If you have a classroom where you have a lot of languages represented, have it in multiple languages. It's very inclusive. It becomes a safe space. Nicole, could you go to the next slide? And I think what I like to call attention here, Dr. Hammond is one of the people now leading this effort. And I love how she explained it, because cultural responsive education is not about using race as a motivator or a conversation started. It's more about providing the students with the agency and the voice to be proud about their own culture, to be proud about their learning styles, to be able to go home and tell their mom, you remember how you taught me how to cook the other day when we were measuring? Well, I was able to use that in math today. That was great. And what is it that we can learn from home before they come to school that we can enhance the teaching and learning for every student? Okay. One of the beauties of this very, very old graphic is that when we say students are affirmed in their cultural connections, We're talking a lot about students who might be bilingual or biracial, or students who come from rural settings as opposed to urban settings. So let's stay away from just thinking about ethnicity and race. This applies to everybody. Students who don't see themselves in college. For years, we were under a mentality, everybody has to go to college. Everybody has to go to college. I'm sorry if I will shock some people. I don't believe that. I don't believe everybody has to go to college. That's the goal. And that's how I raise my kids. But as a parent, I also have to have the flexibility of mind that I have a child who might say, you know what? I want to be a stylist. I want to be a hairdresser. I want to be a car mechanic. So that career path is also part of the culturally responsive education. To let the child also have some agency and some voice. Nicole, please, the next slide. Some of the things, and Melissa, thank you so much, because what you said about construct lessons that promote both SEL and CRE, it cannot be left as like the salt you add to your food. It has to be in the sauce. It has to be intentionally planned. And there's many ways to make any lesson more culturally responsive. Gamify it, play games. There are kids who are not that competitive. So you don't have to have very high stakes. You can have more calm environment, but still some competition. You can have teams. You can have cross helping each other, make it more social. A jigsaw where students have to go to different parts of the room or different groups and interact to make it more social so that they can develop some agency, how to approach different groups and make it social. And teachers could be very good at this, and most of them really are. But we have come from a point of view lately that anything that you do when you play, when you make things social, when you make it a story, when you narrate, is not strict curriculum. And that is a fallacy. And I urge content providers and content makers to keep this in mind. That we need to integrate the gamifying and make it social and make stories significant. Let students have a voice, let them choose their stories, especially let's say in high school, allow them that safe space to say, I really want to go to college, or, I would love to have an internship and make a game that can be sold by Nintendo, things like that, because there are so many different paths to get to this, and we need to embrace them. We need to give them a voice and some agency. I recommend anybody who wants to learn what's happening in culturally responsive education. Soretta Hammond just published about culturally responsive education and the brain, and it's a very good read. Next slide. Nicole, thank you. There's a lot of benefits to culturally responsive education, embracing it not only in your classroom, but in your school, in your district, that everybody has the same vocabulary, the same voice. And I think we're going to hear this recurrent theme of the importance of including these elements throughout the 3 presenters. One of the beauties of culturally responsive education is that it is an outstanding way to diminish the learning gap. And if we've learned anything from the pandemic, is that not every student had the same type of access. We were all in the same storm, but with different boats. Different boats. Some people had a rowboat, some people had a yacht, and some people had something in between. Some kids had to go to a McDonald's to use the free Wi-Fi. I think every district in this country has come to terms with that. I know in many schools in South Florida, they've teamed up with cable providers to ameliorate that problem, but it's a reality. Not every student has the same at home. I was asked to observe teachers during the pandemic, and And the goal of the principals were to make sure the kids were online. And you know what? Cultural responsive education lens helped me explain to some principals that some kids were embarrassed. They did not want to show their space, especially high school students. Some kids did not want to. I had the opportunity to interview some of these children, and I use a lot of the SEL practices to be very sensitive and to ask them. And they said, I'm very embarrassed. And I go, you shouldn't be embarrassed because your parents are providing you with a home. You might not have a desk, but you have a table and you have all your things and you have a laptop and you have cable. So, but if you're not comfortable, make sure you participate via chat. Make sure that when they go into a room and you can be alone with your teacher, you share this so that they see you're actively participating. That was very important in our community, that principals and the powers that be understood, especially middle school and high school students, didn't feel all comfortable with sharing. We also have the opposite. We have kids who live in opulence who didn't want to share that because they were also embarrassed. So the beauty of this is when you're looking at things through a culture responsive lens, you are looking at every component, at every element. And that's why it's so important that the sense of belonging, that everybody should have a safe space, that people have the right to be heard, challenged with a very ambitious curriculum and goals that should be met but respected, okay? So I think I have one more slide, or if I don't, I do want to talk about some of the challenges and we can stop my sharing. Some of the challenges, I think, just like Melissa mentioned, is some misconceptions that have happened. Cultural responsive education has been here since 1994. It is a cornerstone of teacher preparation programs where I spent the majority of my career. I was a teacher educator for over 25, 28 years. And by the way, Melissa, in Florida, your program is big. CASEL is required by all teacher education programs, and the Florida Association for Colleges of Teacher Ed, you might get an invite to come speak to us. So I can tell you we embrace it. Kevin, anything else that you think I should touch upon?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing is, you've said this has been around since the 90s. What's driving the importance now? We're hearing a lot more about this, just like with SEL. In the last few years, it's come to the forefront. What do you see as driving that?
I think that let's be very clear that culturally relevant education has been in place for many of the ESOL components of the curriculum. To be able to reach out to parents in a comprehensive way, in a culturally sensitive way. But I think because of the diversity in the United States and the migration patterns in the United States that were caused by the 2008 recession and now with the pandemic, I can tell you that I hear from middle states like Wisconsin and others where their ESOL population, the bilingual population, is growing. And they're trying to find ways to engage with this population in a more meaningful manner. So I think that's why cultural responsive education is having a resurgence in the north, in the middle of the United States. It's very popular in California. It's very popular in South Florida. I think a lot of our districts use it, but I think it's becoming popular all over the United States and in other parts of the world where you see a lot more diversity.
Interesting. So sort of what I'm hearing, it sounds like that would apply for SEL as well, that as the makeup of our school is changing, as the way we're understanding how to relate to one another is changing, these two principles, which obviously there's a lot of overlap, become even more important, because this is all about how are we relating to students and how are we teaching them to relate to themselves and to others.
Yes, and Oh, I was just going to add, not only are the students and the sort of the diversity of students is changing and growing, not so for the workforce. And so you have often a cultural disconnect between the teacher and the growing diversity in his or her classroom. And so it's even more important that professional learning includes culturally responsive and social and emotional learning so that adults themselves can learn how to empathize and learn how to create a sense of belonging, even for kids who may not feel that sort of naturally. So we need to, I 100% agree. And there's a lot of overlap between the culturally responsive education and the SEL strategies that, that we see are really important. And one more point, when people look at SEL and culturally responsive education, there's some key areas of SEL that they tend to highlight that you've highlighted within each of the 5 competencies. So affirming identity is one really key piece for self-awareness. Creating that sense of belonging is key for that social awareness. Developing agency is key for that self-management. Collaboration and relationship building amongst kids is key for the relationship skills. And then demonstrating curiosity and is part of our responsible decision making, that you have open-mindedness and curiosity towards each other. So there's pieces of SEL that are specifically even more sort of on the forefront when we're talking about that that integration that I wanted to just highlight.
Right. And another thing is, from my perspective, is that the social emotional learning component, I see it as the base, as the pillar that permeates, that should ideally permeate the curriculum, not only in K-12, but in teacher prep.
Yeah.
And that's how I plan my courses. Okay. And my area of expertise was ESOL, English as a Second Language. And that's what I taught in Bay County. And that's what I taught in curriculum and instruction and all that. But for me, the social emotional learning is the foundation. And then it integrates extremely well with the culturally relevant education. Mm-hmm. And I would love to see some professional learning opportunities in schools and districts that marry the two, because I think there's an ideal situation to marry the two and empower teachers to see how to plan a lesson using these two things, these two lenses. It really is very powerful. I also think, to your original question, Kevin, is that we're having, we can't avoid the racial reckoning and the need to look at culture, not only through the culturally relevant pedagogy. The beauty of it is that you can look at LGBTQ students, you can look at socioeconomics, you can look at race, you can look at ethnicity, you can look at language. So you cannot pigeonhole SEL or critical relevant, culturally relevant education. It just fits everywhere.
Mm-hmm. So I want to transition to Rich for a second. Rich, you've been extremely patient, but I think that this all builds really well in thinking about career and technical education, because as Melissa noted, this is more than just teaching people about, how to do a job, but there's also this component of how to function within a workplace. So let's back up a second, though, and just get a definition, as we did with the others. So career and technical education, what is it, and why does it matter?
So career and technical education is the definition of putting together pathways for students to be able to get into professions that may not require a 4-year education typically, but what I think people are sometimes surprised about, CTEs, the most popular ones are actually arts and audio visual, business and management and administration and healthcare. People usually associate CTE with more technical trades, manufacturing, and plumbing, electrical, which are all part of the equation. But this other end of it, which could also include basic level cybersecurity, have components within CTE. So CTE is really these training programs that can get students from where they are in high school and get them into the a profession in a expeditious way. Without a traditional liberal arts education, but have them perform in a I guess be able to aptly perform those entry-level jobs to their abilities. And so we need to be able to provide those pathways and training and awareness of what CTE is.
Excellent. So you mentioned that this is an alternative to a traditional liberal arts education, but there are some things that that one gets from a liberal arts education, such as critical thinking, problem solving, that do seem applicable. How is that being handled in the CTE space? What are folks doing to build those skills?
Well, that's a great question, Kevin. I would say, to kind of preamble to that, is I'm a big advocate of a 12-year education plan, because I think the pre-K helps to build a more assured learner, which really helps with some of the components of soft skills that you just talked about. When the student has some agency and ability, and they're assured in their learning, they'll make better decisions about their pathways, and they'll also be able to have better skills to handle that those pathways. And then the extra 2 years allows students to be able to self-select a pathway and learning options. You know, currently, the way we've structured our education environment, students are very programmed through high school graduation, and they don't have a lot of flexibility in terms of what they take in. And so that extra 2 years is really, I think, a terrific way in which to say, you know what, you graduate high school and now you get to choose what you want to do. And if we provide enough capacity early on for them to see what the pathways are, they will be able to better make decisions about what that extra learning will entail. So what we're doing in terms of finding or helping students develop some of those skills, you know, obviously there's parts of every curriculum that embeds certain skill building. What I'm seeing through CareerPath, you know, we're talking to educators from both high school, workforce development. We also talk to employers. A lot of times what we're seeing is students, and because of what Melissa and Gloria pointed out, is sometimes they lack some agency. We almost program them too much that some of those soft skills are missing. We're trying to bring that back in by providing it through our technology, so they can self-select the ability to understand what they are. You know, what is critical thinking? You know, as an example. And if I could self-select and start to learn about that, I may become more aware and say, oh, I'm kind of getting that in my part-time job, or I'm learning about, you know, how to communicate with others through these other experiences that I'm having. So we're trying to bring it into the career building process, so that the students can see what those skills are. What are employers expecting from them is also really critically important, and building those expectations in with those pathways, so that they're not only seeing, you know, hey, if I want to go into healthcare, entry-level healthcare, here are the courses I need to take, but also here are the skills I need to build so that I'm ready for that job day one. So having those conversations with the employers, building the paradigm and putting together the curricular content so that they understand how to achieve those skills are some of the things that we're seeing trending in CTE.
Excellent. Another thing that I was surprised with as we started digging into CTE is it starts much earlier than I remembered from my own experience. When the CTE areas are a lot different than they were 15, 20 years ago, but we're seeing it even in the middle school, right? Where students are starting to look at career exploration. Could you talk a little bit about what's driving that, and how that helps students in that address their own agency?
Sure, sure. Well, I think what people are seeing is that there's so many students that don't have a clear understanding of what they want to do when they graduate high school. You know, we have the college debt problem, students going into a college environment, not being sure, and then being laden with debt and not being able to service that debt once they graduate, or not having the awareness that, let's say I'm going to go to become a teacher. I'm going to earn $60,000 a year for 5 to 10 years and then get up to 70 and 80. But if I have $150,000 worth of debt, you know, it doesn't, you know, I can't service that debt in a fair amount of time. So building some awareness of those factors. But what's also driving that earlier and earlier pathways is that we have a real shortage of mid-level or mid kind of career employees in this country. You know, we've worked so hard to push kids to college that we've forgotten a couple things. One is not every student is right for 4-year college, and we have a whole bunch of jobs out there that don't require 4-year education. And so how do we provide both of those things, and then giving the students the opportunity to understand them and be able to make better choices. You know, I've seen through both my work with educators and the workforce, and also as a coach, you know, and watching students develop, that not every student, you know, early on is going to make a great long-term student, but they have capabilities that need to be pointed out. And so building some confidence with those students, with the capabilities they have, and then giving them the opportunity to see what's available. And if I take these classes, you know, this is where it can lead. Those are some of the trending things. And so the earlier we can provide that, the better off the student's going to be. And frankly, the better off society is going to be, because we have a real challenge right now of connecting those dots, with the students unaware, the educators overworked. I mean, the pandemic put a light on that. And then we have employers frustrated because they can't get the right kind of employees. And so the system is clearly broken. And we need to provide a better overlay for that, so that we can seam some of the gaps that are forming.
I'm glad you mentioned that about the sort of, it's almost a pipeline problem, right? Leading to the employers, and we're just now starting to look at what things need to be done earlier when students are younger to help prepare them for that. What are some of the other challenges you see around CTE?
Well, I think that there's a big proficiency gap, especially with computer science. A lot of CTE requires some kind of technology training, Kevin, and awareness. Our kids are great with their phones, but they don't know how to transition that into a career environment. Now, there is a lot of movement towards computer science earlier and earlier in our educational process, but many states don't certify teachers for computer science. I mean, Connecticut just did it this year, which is just, it's unbelievable to think about. You know, we didn't certify computer science teachers for K-12, but we're finally doing it, when this is a ubiquitous part of every single career that we have, no matter where you are. Cybersecurity is another one. I'm doing some work with a group called Cybint out of Israel, which has a cybersecurity curriculum. They're trying to help to get that seated at younger and younger audiences, because it's clear that that's not a problem that's going to go away, but it also infiltrates everything we do. So giving the teachers the ability to understand and to teach technology earlier is really important, and what the repercussions are in those pathways. And so being able to put those together, the education and the learning with these career clusters and pathways, is really important. And we're seeing trends towards getting that into students even before freshman year, into 5, 6, 7, 8. And so I'm happy to see that going on right now.
One of the other things that we heard from both Melissa and Gloria is that both of the areas that they're connected with have a bit of a perception problem. Is that true for CTE as well?
Oh, absolutely. I think for so long this was a vilified thing in our society because it's our own arrogance as parents and teachers. We want to see our child go to a 4-year school. I have 4 kids. I was very proud of my sons going to great colleges, and my daughter wants to become a beautician. She's going to be a hairdresser. She just graduated high school, and it's just a wonderful thing to see a kid who is confident going into a career where I know she's going to do terrific. She doesn't need a 4-year degree. Now, the same goes with manufacturing or plumbing. I know a plumber who makes over $350,000 a year. There's great opportunities out there for these CTE careers. And again, we shouldn't vilify them. So I think that's a big problem, and teachers as well. Schools publish these lists of high schools publish lists of where their kids are going to college, and I think that does a disservice to CTE. I'd like to see some of that corrected. It's more about these are pathways our kids are aiming towards, and so we've given our kids agency, we've given our kids self-assurance that they can be successful no matter where they choose to go. That is a more important list to me than 5 kids went to Harvard.
Mhm.
Whoopee. I know some, that's not to put a to disparage Harvard or a great university by any means, because they're important. But I think we're going to see a big shift, Kev. Some of these colleges that don't have the big funding are going to go away. We're already starting to see that happening. And so we're going to be left with a smaller core group of 4-year colleges that are going to service our kids. And what's rising is these other, community colleges and initiatives to train students, whether it's through an edX environment or Coursera. There's lots of other things that are popping up to replace the 4-year institutions that we're going to lose. And I think it's a needed shift, frankly.
Yeah, it's interesting because this really connects with CRE in a way, in that you are helping students connect with opportunities that really speak to who they are or what they want to do, right? You're helping them find the path that's meaningful to them instead of trying to shove them through. So getting thumbs up all around. So I think that must be an accurate point. We have a couple minutes left. In our pre-warm-up for this, what was great about it was the conversation amongst the three of you. So I wanted to leave a couple minutes just to see if there was anything that either of you wanted to ask. Gloria, you're raising your hand. What do you got?
I think Rich touched upon something that I find fascinating, and I think it has to do with the immigrant parent that you might want to think about a little bit, because the American dream includes the 4-year degree, and it's a disservice to these parents. So we need to change that narrative in different languages, that they understand that there is a beautiful pathway to a career, no student debt, and following their students' passion, their children's passion. So, anything, I think it's a conversation that needs to be had with educators, with counselors, especially with community organizations that work with the immigrant parents, because I don't see that anywhere happening.
Yeah.
And I think that would be key to embrace the beauty of CTE. And like you said, I think we're going to start pushing for those lists to include so-and-so is going to this community college for video gaming or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. I also want to say, and I don't know if where you all live, but Florida started, actually, I was part of that conversation and that leadership, is that we have 4-year degrees at the community college level in Florida. We offer teacher education and nursing and cybersecurity. So the cost is a lot less. It was a huge fight. It took over almost 15 years, but the first programs were in teacher ed, and they're offered in community colleges. So that's why in Florida, community colleges are called state colleges. And then our state universities are called state universities.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, just for content makers and others to understand that there are different paradigms and there are different construction models to get more kids in the pipeline. That's something that's doable with policy, legislation, et cetera.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I would just add that one thing that I think is a common theme among all of our comments is this idea of kind of affirming the identity of the individual and what it is that they're passionate about, which has to happen in order to create that sense of belonging, because no one will feel belonging if the the messaging is everyone must go to college, but that's not what you want, or if the messaging is that high expectations only means this as opposed to being that. So I think affirming identity is such a key element, and it can be done in so many different ways by really building on relationships and teaching teachers how to facilitate real relationships among kids, not superficial ones, and also creating an environment where the kids feel known, that they actually, their interests, their culture, their traditions, their styles of learning is known to the teacher, and the teacher makes him or herself more known to the students about who they are as a person. Rich mentioned also coaching earlier about like in sports coaches tend to be really good at creating belonging and affirming identity. So this is my linebacker, this is my quarterback, or whatever. I'm not one for sports metaphors, but they do have a good history of creating cohesion, because there's a belief that we all want the same goal, which is to be successful individually and as a group.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe in you. I believe in our team. I believe we can win if we each take our uniqueness and put it together. And I think if we as educators thought more like that about individuals are different and affirming their strengths and creating a team of belonging towards a common goal, more kids would feel engaged in their education, affirmed, and go on to, we would avoid some of the pitfalls we see of disengagement or dropping out. And by the way, we've seen teachers do this even in remote learning. So it's so important. And I think it's sort of the underlying message of all of the comments I've heard today.
Well, no, that's perfect. And we are just at the top of the hour. So I am going to leave it at that, because I think that is a perfect way to summarize what we're seeing and how these things are connected. So thank you, everybody. Thanks to my panelists. Thanks to Nicole behind the scenes. And we look forward to the next webinar.
Thank you. Take care, Kevin. Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.